Hello and welcome to this eSchool News webinar, Back Office Technology, Building a Resilient District. My name is Chris Hobson, and I am the Custom Content Manager for eSchool News. And I'm excited to have you join us for what should be a very informative session. Today's webinar is sponsored by SparkRock. SparkRock is an ERP solution provider for K-12 and other government-funded organizations across USA and Canada. They are currently the #1 financial systems provider for school boards in Canada. And as a Microsoft Gold partner, SparkRock has built a comprehensive set of finance and workforce management capabilities above and beyond what Dynamics Business Central can normally provide for school districts. Before I introduce our presenter, I'd like to take a minute to go over some features of the platform that we'll be using for this webinar. Today's event will be recorded, so you don't have to worry about missing a thing. Within a few days, you'll receive an email message that contains a link to the recorded webinar, along with a PDF of the slides. You can submit questions at any time during the presentation by clicking on the Q&A box. There will be time at the end of the presentation for our panelists to address questions. Also, there is a group chat function that you can launch by clicking on Chat. Feel free to use this feature to chat amongst yourselves or to contact someone from eSchool News if you have a technical question. But please don't use this feature to ask questions of our speaker. If you have a question for the speaker, you can use the Q&A box that I just mentioned. With these housekeeping items out of the way, let's get started with our presentation. The presenter today is Michael Campbell, President of Advancing Global Edu. While serving in various strategic executive marketing management positions in the PK through 20 technology and publishing industries, Michael has championed industry innovations in data management and student engagement strategies, helping to influence growth and innovation in the industry. At this time, I'm going to turn things over to Michael to begin the presentation.
Thanks, Chris. Let's see if we can get to my slide here. There we go. So thanks for joining us today. So just a little bit of an overview of what we'll be talking about today. We'll start off talking about the impact of the pandemic on educational institutions. We'll go through a checklist of your back office processes and systems. We'll talk about strategies to manage expectations. We'll go through some best practices, and then we'll wrap up with how to be an agent of change within your school or your district. And then, as Chris said, then I'll turn it back over to Chris and we'll have some questions at the very end. There we go. Remote teaching has been a challenge for schools across the country during the shutdowns in the past few weeks caused by the pandemic. Many districts were prepared to deliver instructions remotely, weren't prepared to deliver instruction remotely, and many families nationwide lacked access to Wi-Fi and digital devices necessary to complete online learning and homework. So you may have to fight a battle more than once to win it is a quote that Margaret Thatcher came up with. And I thought this was appropriate since most of us have exchanged our desk at our offices for our kitchen tables, even our bedroom beds, everything else. And you know, we have our kids running through our offices now. We have our dogs barking. We have our neighbors mowing the lawn. Everything else going on now while we're trying to work. In the last 6 to 8 weeks, our lives have been completely turned upside down, both professionally and personally. And And if you have kids, you're now having to manage their daily lives while trying to manage your work lives at the same time. And since most of you are administrators, you're also managing your staff as well. Everybody is stressed no matter what you're doing. So, and unfortunately, we're seeing that as the virus peaks in some parts of the country and we try to prevent a reoccurrence, our communities are impatient, and who can blame them? We've been cooped up and asked to sacrifice, and we continue to be asked to sacrifice, and we know that there's no quick answer, and that the vaccine is nowhere near to be completed anytime soon. Our educators, like many of other frontline contributors, are finally getting the praise that they deserve in our society and in our country. So education is on the media's front page every day now. Parents understand that the work that you and your staff are doing, putting into engaging their kids in the learning process, and how hard it is to engage them through remote learning is actually something new. They're having to recreate their jobs. And you as administrators are tasked with the strategies that have to be implemented to make sure that your systems are top notch and your people are prepared and you have the resources available to execute. So today, we're going to talk about resilient organizations. But let's face it, it takes resilient folks like yourself to make resilient organizations. You know, and we keep talking about this, but as of today and as of this week, we have either 46 states that have either closed schools for the remainder of the year or have recommended that they've closed schools, with most requiring that they have remote learning strategies. Each and every one of us have been touched by this pandemic. So 94% of all public and private schools in the US have been impacted by the pandemic, which means that 55 million students have been affected in one way or another. When we think about this, I know I live outside of Chicago, and you know, I think about how hard it was for our school district. Was our school district prepared to deal with a complete shutdown of schools when the state asked them to shut down? What was the impact on your systems, on your human resources, on your finances? You know, feel free to chat about that or offer your comments in the chat section about the shutdown and how it affected your school or your school system. So let's talk about resiliency across the organization and across your school or school district. We've seen that there's a strong link between education and a community's ability to cope with crisis. When a crisis or natural disaster strikes, schools are typically closed, and there's a reason for that, because they provide shelter and services for that community. And we see that happening right now. Look at how many schools and school districts are providing meals for family in needs right now. Your district or your school and educators in all positions have been part of helping to prevent or reducing the impact of this contemporary challenge, while also strengthening the resilience of children, communities, and your own education system where you're at. This is why we want to discuss this and why it's so important, not only to have that back office system and process in place, but to have a resilient organization as a whole. So let's define why we want to be resilient. The goal of building a resilient back office organization for your school or district is to minimize the impact of a threat to your ongoing organization. And that can be from a natural disaster, and clearly COVID-19 is a natural disaster for us. Infrastructure outages, we've all seen, you know, cables being cut, power outages, things like that. Supply chain disruption, we're starting to see that kind of thing happening with, you know, COVID hitting our meat chain and things happening, cyber attacks, sabotage, theft, and even political disruptions. As we, our school and districts need to be, resilient across the entire interconnected operations, including HR, your workforce, your staffing, finance, and systems. And as we've seen, education has been in the media throughout the pandemic. And as this economic crisis becomes more of an issue for our state and local government in the next year, the economic disruptions can and will disrupt schools and the schools and how they're reliant based on their tax base, grants, federal funding, and the funding formulas that are out there. So let's take a look at how we can put a resilient plan in place. Starting with the workforce. So if you look at this, we look at key areas that impact whether your staff can efficiently operate through a crisis. And that could be, as we think about the fall and reopening our schools, health and safety will be extremely important, communication and collaboration, and then their access to that systems and data. Like I said, the personal safety of your staff is extremely important. How you communicate those policies has to be more than just an email. You need to know that they need to be digested and understood and even signed off in some cases. As a resilient organization, how do you get that confirmation from your staff? With your staff working at home and not in the classroom and not in their traditional hours, how are you negotiating new union contracts? Have you put in place new travel policies? What about compensation and sick leave? If you have a staff member or teacher who is exposed to COVID, what is the policy for returning to work? All of these are important, and it just depends on where you're at in the digital, your digital journey. If you have an older system, and you may have traditionally relied on a paper format, and trying to monitor these kinds of things and track these kinds of things and audit these kinds of things may have proved challenging in the last few weeks. But hopefully you found some kind of workaround as you've transitioned to a more digital process. Have you ever heard the saying, over-communicate? I think a lot of us have tried to over-communicate in the last few weeks. Employees need to understand the implications of what your school or school district is trying to accomplish so they can be up to speed, and making sure that they can understand how to use your communications tool, be it Zoom, Microsoft Teams, GoToMeetings, whatever tool that you're using. So thus, you need to have that increased cadence, that more information is possible to get that information out to them. Increase that core communication. What is it that the mission that you're trying to accomplish here? And then the collaboration is so important these days. Having online team meetings, making sure that they can share information between each other and with the organization, making sure that they can have access to HR information as quickly as possible. If you think about our journey across the organization, systems become even more important when everyone is working at home. So systems are the next thing that we want to talk about. And having remote systems and data access is extremely important when in a situation that we're at. Do does everyone have access to the right tools in order to do their jobs? Depending on where your school is or your district is with their technology, you may be dealing with some older legacy issues or legacy systems. How are they accessing those remotely? You know, are they dealing with a VPN? Do they have a remote desktop system? What about, are they dealing with if you have a newer system that's all in the web or cloud-based system, how are they accessing that? Through the browser, web apps, through their mobile apps? You want to make sure that everyone is on the same page with your systems and with the security involved with those. And while we talk about the elements of a resilient system, a lot of people talk about the logistics of a resilient system. But let's talk a little bit about the strategy of that. And, measure what matters most with the data. From the business side and from the learning side, be clear about what your school or district must have from the data so that everyone can be successful. And make sure that the data use make the data use possible for everybody so that your leaders have the flexibility, the training and support they need to answer their questions and take action on the data that they can get from your systems. You also want to be transparent and earn trust. That's extremely important these days. Ensure that every community understands how its schools and its budgets and students are doing and why the data is so valuable and how it's protected and used. When your teachers, when your parents, when your board can't trust the data, then you have a problem. And then finally, guarantee access and protect the privacy. Provide teachers and parents timely information on their students and make sure it's kept safe. You've heard over and over, data privacy issues that have happened, not necessarily in schools or in school districts, but in other, especially with credit card companies and things like that. So, data privacy is huge, an issue across systems issues. There we go. You can't talk about data without systems interruptions. And the IT folks usually want to talk about this. But as a resilient organization, you always need a recovery plan. And you need a team, whether it's your IT person or a crisis response team. You need to have that plan in place before it happens. So predetermine your response procedures. And I can't stress enough the strong vendor relationships because they can be your biggest friend when you have a recovery, when you have a systems interruption. Especially and as well as when you're doing a systems upgrade or you want to move to a new system. And then finally, if reducing the risk is always best, and that can be accomplished with such things as having a solution that is cloud-based, having that IT hardware, having that communication infrastructure that's there. When you talk about data backup and recovery, they're also essential. Having an offsite backup, make sure that it's accessible, make sure that you have a timely backup, that it's scheduled correctly, as well as making sure that the recovery process can be validated and one that the process is understood and worked for all the folks in your group, and one that meets the TTR threshold for your team. And then we move into finances. So finances, most schools and districts need to manage their sources of revenue from local tax revenue, state, and then the smallest piece comes from the federal area. And many of the state and federal agencies require funds to be expended in specific categories and by certain dates. How does your current accounting system help manage this process? And this year will be a particularly interesting year since most of public institutions end on June, their fiscal year ends on June 30th. How's this year going to change your budgeting process with your boards and with your school or district? Has this year's crisis changed your budgeting process? If you think about procurement as part of your financial processes, if you've had to had sign-offs in the past that were manual, you want to consider moving to a systems enforcement tool this now. Moving to online requisitions, you'll be able to track and you'll be able to see the implications, especially if you've done this manually or with spreadsheets. A good example of that we've seen here in Illinois has been Chicago Public School just have budgeted about $75 million in hardware and for their remote learning program for students to have access for students who had not previously had access to that. You know, having to try to track the procurement of a program like this can't be done with spreadsheets, paper POs, those kinds of things. So you want to have a system in place that can track those kinds of things. And, you know, as well, you know, as, you know, the budget crisis increases, you know, many states and cities and districts will have a deficit due to the budget crisis. And, you know, the budget process will be more important than ever. You know, have you developed a new process that will outline the roles and responsibilities of all your stakeholders? Have you started to put together a process for communicating that budget process so that, you know, what's your plan A, what's your plan B, so that you can make sure that all your stakeholders understand what your fallback positions are in the budgeting process? So as you consider managing a resilient organization, part of that is managing your district and teacher expectations. Research shows that during a period of uncertainty and a lack of control in our daily lives can lead to increased anxiety. And in times like these, it's important that we build and maintain positivity. You know, positive social support can improve our resilience for coping with stress. So, you know, to do that, you can do that through communications. So, and so we put together three, oh, is it going to click? 3 key ways that you can do that for your district. And those 3 key areas are documentation, budget forecasting, and scheduling. In documentation, you know, roles change throughout the year, and even now, you know, through all of this, you roles are changing, and especially at the end of the school year, roles are changing from part-time to full-time or vice versa. And it's important that you track these changes and keep records attached to those positions, along with descriptions and the number of people assigned to those positions. Which sites are relevant to that position, where each position salary comes from, and so on. And changes done manually can cause confusion in payroll and HR. And right now is just a horrible time to have to deal with those kinds of things. So you want to make sure that your HR system is talking to your that all your systems are integrated and talking together. Budget forecasting, we talked a little bit about that. When you're talking about budget forecasting, once a position is approved and documented and your systems have all of the relevant information for the fiscal year, they can be more, you want to make it as accurately and forecast as possible. Tying the different types of positions to that budget forecast helps account for that 85% of your district's budget dedicated to salaries. Without strong position control and documentation, as well as most people that your budgets can't be accurately allocated. And then on scheduling, the position record contains the common schedule for each employee assigned. And, most districts have 12-month positions, 9-month positions, or some other configuration that need to be the same for each position that's out there. And as well as for attendance for your folks who are there. A robust system that can track absences in real time and the ability to track the reason behind them in a standard way can help you in your district. And having the folks, having your teachers, having your staff understand that will help. Our research found that staff absenteeism costs the K-12 sector about $5.6 billion annually. Think about how many full-time employees you could hire with $5.6 billion every year. So let's talk a little bit about back office practices. So if you look at this slide here, it may be a bit much for you, but we'll try to go through this. So we tried to put this together as identify, examine, prepare, ensure, run, work, complete, train, provide, and then train. And starting at the top, identify the leaders to own and champion the effort. Who's leading the charge? Do you have a team of folks? Is it your business manager? Is it your IT director? You want to draw from their experiences and acknowledge that every problem has a solution within your organization, within your school or your district. Having a process in place and putting a checklist together will keep your IT or business office on track in planning. So when you examine your back office processes, have you put together a team in your business office and technology team to own the effort and to look for ways to improve the processes? So, prepare a master list of your master data sets to examine before and after the rollout. So when you do that, don't do that in a vacuum. Make sure you get buy-in from the different departments, from HR, from procurement, from the different areas. Examine your processes to make sure that are all documented. Remember, if you have a paper system or other, spreadsheets, maybe you've been working with You want to have a redundant, you want to have redundant systems so that you can duplicate the process electronically if possible, and tie each process back to your business objectives. Can your current IT system be upgraded to handle any new capabilities? I'm sure, most everyone has become best friends with the folks in IT in the last month, trying to get the different systems running remotely. Make sure you're testing and validating the new infrastructure in your current environment. You want to work with the departments on implementing the specifications and customization so that, that they understand how it's going to work within their environment. Whether it's HR, whether it's food services, whatever the case may be. Working with your various departments is very, very important. That collaboration will help you complete the system setup and configuration, whether you're doing an upgrade, whether you're doing a completely new system, whether you are trying to do any kind of change management within your organization. And then make sure you're providing, official user training. I think, whether you're a principal, whether you're a school secretary, if you're having to put in any kind of procurement information, vendor information, if you've got somebody using a district credit card and they have to go through some kind of process of doing that, it's so important to provide them that official user training because it's frustrating for them, to get in there and try to do that when they can't use the system correctly. And then train your help desk. And this goes back to providing or partnering with the vendor, making sure that they get the help desk support and making sure that the folks in IT or however you have that set up are trained correctly also. And then, when we work with either school districts or schools or with our vendors, I always ask them, what would you add to this list? What other things would you add to, to a best practice checklist? Are there other things that you have seen when you've added back office processes or systems or upgrades, to make sure that it works best for your school or your system? Are there other things that you would have added to this list? And so, one of the things that, we always want to talk about is how can you be an agent of change? An agent of change does something to take action for substantial change. Today, playing the role of an agent of change may never be more important in a school or a school district. Education has changed as we now know it. We have a new normal, and it's never going to be the same as it was before. And you have an opportunity to lead a resilient organization smoothly and regularly. With that in mind, here's a few tips that we have for being an agent of change for your organization from a back office standpoint. For your workforce, always remember that people are not afraid of change so much as they have fears and concerns about new ways of doing things. They also have some, dedication to ways in which they've always done things. Think about the remote learning plans. You're asking your teachers to leave their comfort zone and communicate learning and engagement in a new way. Communicate consistently, frequently, and through multiple channels, including speaking, writing, video, training, focus groups, bulletin boards, anything that you can think about. And notice that listening and getting involved is the key to success. Communication, all that you know about the changes as quickly as the information is available. And believe me, everybody knows that these days that is almost overload. Make clear that your bias is towards instant communication, so some of the details may change at a later date. Your staff will appreciate it. Thinking about finances, I broke this down into 3 key areas: strategy, planning, sourcing, and sourcing. Under strategy, think about your mission and benefit and the benefits of that. It simply means providing the support to your school or district operations and services of the citizens by procuring the required items from the best possible vendors. When you're doing the planning, identify who the end user is within the district and what they require of those services, such as quantity and frequency. And then sourcing and solicitation, find the best, pricing or quality strategy, what is the strategy for that while still complying with the laws and procedures, and lay out the plan so that they can easily be communicated to all the stakeholders involved. And then, if you have, if it's a large enough procurement where you have to have a contract, make sure that they have the contract and demonstrate that there is a plan and an implementation process in place. And as always, tie your processes back to the business objective and processes. And then under systems, raise your hand if you've had, during the past 6 weeks, challenges with your systems. Some of our clients, we've heard stories of districts having to issue paper checks for payroll and accounts payable, and the challenges involved in getting the proper sign-offs with social distancing. What if you have a legacy system and you don't have your data and systems in the cloud? How have you had to manage that? I'll tell you this story of, what has happened here. We had a business manager who signed off checks, took the checks, put it in another person's mailbox. And it was like the Pony Express around here to get the sign-offs on checks here. So, how has your HR team managed their systems? What about hiring people? What about, has that changed within your systems? Going back to the best practices, we would suggest that you examine your best back office processes. Put together a cross-functional team to make sure you can provide the best solution for your school or district by examining those processes related to your business processes. So in closing, I put together this little quote that says, "She stood in the storm, and when the wind did not blow her away, she adjusted her sails." And I think that this really kind of encompasses what I think resilience is. Because until they develop a vaccine for the COVID-19 virus, our institutions will have to be nimble. And we may find that we have to adjust our strategies due to the outside forces, such as the virus, such as politics, such as budgets. But as a resilient organization, the business of educating our children will not stop. And you will have to make sure that all the stakeholders have the resources they need to be successful. And as resilient people, you can do that. So, I want to thank you today for joining me for our webinar. I want to thank SparkRock. SparkRock is the leading provider of financial and school management ERP software. They serve a number of schools here in the U.S. and Canada. They're the #1 ERP software in Canada, and they're Microsoft Gold Partner. And thank you to eSchool News for sponsoring our webinar today. Chris, do you want to take it for questions now?
Sure, Michael. Thanks a lot. I think it was a very, very informative presentation. We have about, I'd say 15 minutes for some Q&A. I've got some questions here. Hopefully, Michael can give us some insight on.
Sure.
First question is, from your research, what is the cost of not becoming resilient? Michael?
Yeah, hold on one second.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say that the dysfunction out there, of not being resilient is the fact that you can have schools and systems that are very dysfunctional. That you could put a number on that, actually. There's a number out there, I forget what it is, something like $83 million or something like that, that is out there that, that shows that, that you could put out there that, that shows that, that schools that are not, organized in a resilient fashion have been, easily, they suffer financially for that.
Okay, another question here for you. It says, we are a small district in South Central US with limited staff. Where should we start?
I would definitely start by putting a team together with your business manager and your IT manager and maybe your, your superintendent together and saying, what back office processes have we had a challenge with, and where can we be better?
Okay. Another one here, from the 3 focus areas of workforce, finance, and systems, which do you feel is the most important?
People are always the #1 thing that I think are most important. And that's because that's where we put the majority of our money in a district for our, our budget. 85% of our money goes to people, so that's where I would always put that at, because, we negotiate contracts with unions, we put salaries to that. So definitely people would be the #1 thing, I would say. And because of that, that's why, we always put the communication, health and safety, all those kinds of things, compensation, sick leave, those are the most important, aspects of that. I'm not saying that, budgeting, finance, all those things are not important, because all those things do roll up into that. But, the people are, that in district, those are your teachers. Those are the people who are what we do as a school district.
All right. How are others getting board approval for increased IT and technology funding?
One thing that I would say is that with the new CARES Act, that could be an opportunity, especially, with the data, with the CARES Act could be one thing that you could look at with that. And I would definitely take a look at how that could play out in the end with that, because there is some stipulation with remote learning, with and how you could play into some of that money for that.
Can you or SparkRock provide free consultative services for our district to build an action plan?
I will have to speak with the folks at SparkRock, but I'm sure that we could find out and get back to them.
I mean, certainly they can reach them at info@sparkrock.com.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So they could reach out that way.
Yeah.
All right, so if anybody else has any more questions, attendees, please get them in. Otherwise, we're going to finish up here. I'll give you just about 10 or 15 seconds. Okay, with that, if you submit a question or if you get one in now and we didn't get to it, someone from SparkRock will follow up with you directly. I would like to thank our presenter today for a very informative presentation. I'd like to thank all the audience members for joining us as well. As a reminder, you'll get an email within the next few days that contains a link to this recording along with the slides. Thanks again for participating and have a great day.